So we have Kurt on Teams, and I sent an invite to DJ as well, but he's not on just yet.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the May 23rd, 2022 Grants Pass City Council Workshop. And first up on the agenda today, we are talking about street vending zones. Looks like with Brad. Hi, Brad.
Good morning. Yes, we're talking street vending zones today. So this topic came up a couple of weeks ago when Aaron brought up to the council whether or not you wanted to receive some more information about this topic, and I think the majority of you said yes, so here we are. I did want to make a quick point at the beginning that this topic, I think, sometimes gets conflated a little bit with people that are, often not having formal businesses. And in planning school, we actually had a whole section on the informal economy. It's quite an interesting field. The federal government actually has what used to be called SIC, Standard Information Class, or Standard Industry Classification, SIC codes, or now they're called NAICS, North American Industry Classification System, that actually has street vending as its own separate, distinct category. So there's a lot to be said for these in terms of the topic at large. But today I wanted to just give you basically an overview of what the code currently says. And try to stimulate some discussion about how we might want to proceed with vending zones. So that is the subject in summary. Talk about sidewalk mobile vending zones, and it relates to your council goals to facilitate sustainable and manageable growth. So specifically in the Municipal Code, what we're talking about is Chapter 4.08. There's a lot in this chapter. This deals with all things peddlers, solicitors, anyone who might go from door to door selling products. They actually fall underneath this chapter. This chapter also handles food trucks. So there's a lot in here, but specifically we're talking about the vendors that are on sidewalks. This section was created in 2016, or at least significantly amended in 2016, and it does and has since then enabled a permit for sidewalk vendors. But it also says that sidewalk vendors cannot legally locate anywhere in the city without being in a vending zone. There is no such thing. No such zone has ever been created. So technically, they're not permitted because we haven't created the zone. But there's still a lot of work that's been done to think about what kind of standards should we use when regulating these. So as far as definitions and what specifically we're talking about, these are the two most important definitions today. The first one is mobile vending cart, and the second one is a mobile vending zone, sidewalk. So the mobile vending cart, this is the two terms I wanted to point out here is push cart, meaning it's movable under human power. So we are not talking about anything that's motorized. We're not talking about food trucks. And secondly, it's for the sale of food ready to eat. So we're not talking about vendors who are selling other types of products necessarily. The mobile vending zone, as I mentioned, was a new definition, well, not new, but it was created in 2016 and is pretty specific about what they are. It's an area of improved public sidewalk designated by ordinance, where only those operators or vendors licensed as mobile vending carts may operate compliant with standards contained within this title, health code, and other applicable zones, ordinances, and regulations. So here's just a couple of examples of maybe what could qualify as push carts. Again, there's no definition in our code of exactly what that is, other than there is a size maximum that is in the code, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What is distinctively missing from the definition is a table, which is what you may have seen as far as the folks selling strawberries or oranges or some of the others around town that we've seen. We'll have to just get this council's input on that, but under the current definition of mobile vending cart, technically I don't think a table would qualify, although I think it's probably the intent it's covered under the intent. So there are a few other definitions, as I mentioned, that are related to this topic, but we're not talking about today. So the first one I wanted to point out, mobile vending trailer. So these are where the vendor actually stands on or within the frame. And so we typically, at least in community development, have been defining these as being enclosed. So an example of this might be like something you would see at a fairgrounds, maybe, like just during the fair where somebody's just standing inside of an enclosed spot, giving lemonade or snow cones or something like that. So that is not a mobile vending cart. Also mobile food truck, these are motorized vehicles. Sidewalk vending, this is where, as I mentioned, you're only selling personal or tangible personal property, not food, not beverages. Solicitor peddler, these are the ones who would just move from door to door, and they're taking orders for the future. They're not actually vending any food or beverage. They're just sort of taking your order. And then a temporary merchant, that's a category if you're on private property. So again, today we're talking about public property, being within the public right-of-way. So here's the next 4 or 5 slides are going to just kind of summarize what the current municipal code language is. There is quite a bit of language that is specific to this topic, but again, we just haven't used it, so I guess this is maybe more, are you comfortable with what these regulations are, because they are already adopted, and if you created a mobile vending zone, this is what we would enforce in that zone. So the first one, they do have to get a license to operate. Second one, 4.08042, they have to submit an application. It's a pretty basic application. We actually already have one, and it does contain this information. You have to submit a site plan, show the zone, show how you're going to maintain 4 feet of clearance. That's an ADA issue. Description of what you're selling, personal information. There is about a limited background check that is done by police, and then liability insurance. The next section talks about what's exempt. There are 8 different types of solicitors that are exempt from having to get any kind of license. These are just a couple of examples: traveling commercial salespeople, political groups seeking funds, and garage sales. And section 4.08060 talks about the location. This is really what triggered today's conversation. It says that the carts are restricted from public rights of way except in these zones, which again don't exist. 4.08070, so these are general standards of operation that apply to everyone if you're under this section of the code. So I wasn't going to go over in detail all of these. Hopefully you had a chance to kind of glance through them, but these would all apply, including the hours of operation, having to stay in compliance with Americans with Disabilities Act, no amplified music, etc. Continuing on with general standards, no flashing, blinking strobe lights, and there is a specific clause that may be pertinent to this topic, and that's that the equipment can't extend more than 4 feet from the edge of a cart. So again, I think that 4 feet's taking into consideration if you have to maintain 4 feet of clearance in a sidewalk. And then the next section just says that we can issue the permit out of community development as long as they have the approved they're in an approved zone. So then mobile vending carts has its own section currently in the Municipal Code that gives into even more granularity about what's required for these. We already talked about you can only sell food and beverages out of these. They have to be manually movable, no motorized, and there's a maximum size 4 feet by 9 feet by 7 feet high. Have to have at least 2 rubber wheels. Don't forget that part. All signs and lights must be secured to the cart, so you wouldn't be able to have like a freestanding A-frame sign sitting on the road, or a block down pointing you towards the cart. The activity, excluding the queues, the customer queues and the waste cans, are prohibited from being on the sidewalk. Can't lock anything to a parking meter, tree lights, etc. They can't be left unattended for more than 15 consecutive minutes. Utility service connections are not permitted, so you wouldn't be able to hook up to water or sewer with this cart. You have to be basically completely self-contained, and then generators are also not permitted under the current municipal code. Just a couple more of what's covered under the current code. 4.08140 states City Council can reduce, add, or amend sidewalk vending zones by ordinance. And a citizen or business owner can also request a review of these. So again, that's really why we're here, to see if you're interested in creating one of these. The code does outline 4 criteria when creating one of these vending zones that you need to consider. The first 2, at least in staff's perspective, are pretty much the same thing. Sidewalk has to be a minimum of 8 feet wide, and you have to maintain that 4 feet of clearance, and then located in a pedestrian alley, which we just interpret to be sidewalk, where there's adequate space to get the cart in that 4 feet. So those, I think, are pretty much the same thing. But then the next 2 add on to that. Only 2 locations on any block, that would be the maximum, and then other criteria should be considered when creating it, and we can talk a little bit more about that. So here are just some considerations that staff thought of that when you're discussing where exactly these would go. I should say that we do have a layer in our GIS for sidewalks. Unfortunately, the width column in that GIS isn't completed, so it's not like we have a really good record of exactly where our 4-foot sidewalks, 5-foot sidewalks, 6-foot sidewalks, and we have a range of widths throughout the city. So unfortunately, we don't have all that GPSed out to bring you a nice map to say, okay, here's where they are. But we're pretty comfortable in saying that there's very few locations where you have 8-foot sidewalks today. So some vending zone considerations. Potential change, as I mentioned earlier, to include tables. Clarify whether planting strips can be used. I just threw that out there because we have seen that to date. A lot of folks will maybe like put their cart or their table in the planting strip and then be standing on the sidewalk. Currently, we're not necessarily promoting that because, there's often grass or trees or irrigation or something else. It's probably not a great idea, but I think it's an important thing to talk about when we're talking about creating a vending zone. Clear vision triangles, another really important piece for safety. We want to make sure that they're not in a location where you're a driver and you're at the intersection, that they're blocking that clear vision across the intersection. Also, maybe determine the consideration for materials. This is a lot of jurisdictions do talk about the type of materials. If nothing else, they prohibit certain kinds of materials like cardboard boxes or crates or something like that. If you're going to be creating your some kind of aesthetic design standard. And then consider distances from bus stops, ADA parking, ramps, etc. These are a couple other things that we thought of. is particularly in the downtown for the first one, that may be prohibiting within a certain feet of a building entrance. You know, right now, if you look at where we have 8-foot sidewalks and above, you know, they're almost all downtown. So that, you know, do you want to maybe create a certain distance so they're not, you know, right in front of someone's business entrance? Same thing for schools or clinics, and then certainly for a fire hydrant, we see, you know, a lot of significance there, and not obstructing regulatory signage. The last bullet is really just kind of more for maybe the next workshop, assuming you hold another workshop, and sort of that's, you know, depending on how detailed you want to get, what kind of level of enforcement. To date, our CSOs are the ones who would go and talk to somebody and let them know, you know, you're operating illegally, you're going to have to take this down. We would just want to talk about who continues to do that enforcement. Like I say, that's the CSO. I know the chief's not here today to give some feedback on that, but we would recommend that. In terms of cost implication, there really is not much on that front. You know, there's no anticipated impact for just creating the ordinance. The enforcement would presumably be through finance, because they issue the business licenses, community development, and police. And then here's the call to action. It's totally at your discretion. We could do some more research for you on the mapping piece. It would probably take a little bit of time, but we could identify for you exactly, if you wanted to retain that 8-foot standard, where those are. We could also solicit additional input from private industry, Chamber of Commerce. You know, what are their thoughts about this type of land use? Move it to a workshop, or just maintain the status quo.
Thank you, Brad. Council questions. Rob?
Thanks, Brad. So you've got the way it's written now, or I guess the way our code is written now, I guess, or what you're potentially proposing, can't obstruct regulatory signage and so on and so forth, and you need ADA clearance on the sidewalk and so on and so forth. So and they mentioned that the carts could be as high as 7 feet tall. So are we talking about a situation right now where someone could have their cart right up against the building? So someone's storefront could be completely obstructed? I mean, a lot of storefronts put a lot of time and energy into the appearance of their store window. I don't see anything here that would keep a cart away from that window. And so if that's the case, you know, how much space would there have to be? And now, would you need 4 feet on both sides of it? Or I just don't understand what you would be proposing there. Have you thought about that?
Not in great detail, but you raised kind of what triggered that comment about separation from business entrances. You know, and
I'm not talking about the entrance. That's, you know, that's one thing.
Window.
But people put a lot of time into their storefront windows very often, and with a cart that could potentially be 7 feet tall, it could be completely obscured.
Sure.
Right? So but that hasn't been mentioned yet.
That's
Unless
correct.
I didn't see it. Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
But Councilor Pell has a good point. If you look at what some other cities, when they do have this, they could have in their language something that restricts them from being along the building. The majority of those are at the curb, more or less, closer to the away from the building. So,
Brian?
But, yeah. Okay.
Oh, thanks for the presentation. I had a question. Well, I had a handful of questions. In the current code, any operator must obtain a license from the city. How much does that license cost? Is that a flat fee?
It is, like I say, we haven't been issuing them for these because there's no place for them to go. It's very nominal. For our other ones, you know, the mobile food trucks, the ice cream truck vendors, the other ones that fall underneath Title 4.08. I apologize. I didn't look to see what that fee is. It's fairly nominal, but there is a flat fee.
Okay, maybe $50, $100, something like in that range, or is it?
Oh, it's less than that.
Less than that, okay. And then also in that same slide, it talks about it requires the application with a scaled site plan. Would a hand-drawn site plan be acceptable?
It would, yeah. Similar to like our parklets, you know, the sidewalk vending, the sidewalk cafes, we do allow, as long as it's legible and, you know, really marked out well.
Okay. And then it was funny you noted that the carts must have 2 rubber wheels. Do you see that as, you know, that needing to be rubber? I mean, I understand why they need to have wheels. Is the fact that they're rubber really something that needs to be spelled out?
I couldn't think of a good reason. I mean, I understand in terms of impact on the sidewalks, you know, I mean, if you've got a steel and you're, you know, rolling up in town, I mean, there may be some potential damage there, but wood or other types of product, I don't know why that particular definition is the way it is. But it is the wording that's currently in the municipal code.
Okay, I just have a couple more, sorry. So the current code you mentioned, it talks about sites located in pedestrian alleys. Would that include like the downtown alleys? Like in theory, the way this is set up, could they set up in the alleys that are downtown?
I don't think so, because we do define in another section of code how alleys are for vehicular use. And this definition in the municipal code is specific to sidewalks. I mean, it uses the term sidewalk. Again, this is somebody who's interpreting this post-adoption and wasn't involved, but I think that that's intended to be just another term for sidewalk.
Okay, there's a couple different types of alleys. I mean, there's vehicular traffic alleys downtown, and then there's at least a couple that are pedestrian traffic only. So we might want to clear that up. Thank you.
Good point.
Rick?
Thank you, Brad. Could you go back to slide 7? So I would support the number item 3, show 4 feet of unobstructed clearance and passageway. I know reason for this today is because of the Strawberry people and some of the locations they're located in. They have, what I've observed, they've provided the 4-foot unobstructed clearance. In older parts of town, we only have a 4-foot sidewalk. They've located their merchandise and so forth and their chair off, if you want to say, in the landscape strip, and it may not be landscaped per se. So do we need, in fact, one location they used to locate is Foothill and Agnes Avenue. There's no sidewalk there whatsoever. So I didn't know if there's some way. I agree, I'm sensitive to the visual clearance at intersections, that they not block that. But if there's no sidewalk, but there's a space for them to locate, how would we consider putting something like that into language that would allow that location?
Well, I mean, we would still probably recommend keeping the clear vision triangle language the way it is.
Correct.
You know, the kind of the 10-foot, take the corner, 10 foot one way, 10 foot the other way, and staying out of that triangle. There's a lot of considerations there, you know. I mean, if it's where do people park to walk up to the vendor? Where do they keep their extra inventory? You know, are there if it's potentially private property, you know, are you requiring somebody to go and talk to an adjacent private property owner and say, you know, can I use your property? I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios, and I think that's maybe why this didn't get created in 2016, because it'll take a little bit of effort to do it right.
And I've also observed when the Strawberry people come into town that there may be as many as 4 of them at different corners in the city. So if they're coming in for a permit within the city, they would have 4 site plans for those locations. would that be 4 different permits, or would they have one permit with 4 locations?
I would say 4 different permits, because you know each location is going to have different issues to look at and to consider, and kind of the whole reason for a fee is to help to cover staff time in analyzing the site and making sure that it complies with all the codes. So you're going to have to do that for each one of those. So you know, again, this is up to the council to look at.
And then the last item on there is liability insurance. If it's just an individual, I would say a bunch of individuals say, hey, you want to go to Grants Pass next weekend and sell strawberries, and they grab 4 different people, but they don't have a formal business per se. How do we put together liability insurance? They have to get it, but how do they get it? If there's, each individual would have to get an individual liability insurance policy?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So on the liability insurance, what's the dollar amount on that?
It's $1 million.
$1 million per location?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Joel?
So there used to be, Brad, several mobile food trucks that were operating that would go around to businesses. Are they still operating? You know, or they would go in different parts of the city, and they would stop and they would have a schedule during the day.
Are you referring to actual food truck?
Yes.
Yeah. I do not know the answer to that. I'm not aware of us having issued in the last couple of years a specific permit for that. They usually choose a location and go there every day.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they even had a permit. I know they went to the Forest Service every day, and then they would go to other businesses as well. And it was a mobile truck.
Okay. And it's quite possible that they did at some point, you know, come in and get
Okay.
a permit, because that would be different than this. So we could have issued a permit for that type of business.
Sure, and then the mobile vending trailer, there's some existing there that probably like Saturday Morning Market would be the biggest example of that, but we also have some others, like along 6th Street on that bank down there by L Street, where they're retrofitting that bank building, and several other places where I see ribs or Vietnamese or Chinese or whatever. So there's several of those that are already existing. I assume they're already under a permit, or what's the story with that?
Yes, I think most of the ones that I think that you're referring to, we have numerous single mobile food truck permits that have been issued. So
Sure,
yeah, yeah.
okay. And then there's, how does the code address the location of those?
Yeah, well, they're covered under 4.08, but a different section. So they have some different requirements. You know, they're on private property, not public. So you do have to secure the consent of the property owner in writing. You know, you have to remove it every day, or it has to be fenced. You know, you have to have a designated area for people to sit, tables, things like that.
Okay, and then my last question was, you know, I just came back from Sherwood and Beaverton and even downtown Portland, and then I've been over to Florence, and I'm trying to see where I ran into a city that has successfully implemented this in their code, you know, in terms of what I saw on the ground. And I can't recollect anywhere where I saw that being implemented. Do you have any idea of our state and what the other communities have done with it?
On the mobile food carts, I do not. We reached out to a couple, but didn't hear back. So we could certainly provide that, though.
Well, what I've noticed is I didn't see any. That's what I noticed. With the exception, perhaps, those were mainly trailers. There was one place up in Beaverton where they had a fenced-off block that was dedicated solely to trailers, and I think they did have some carts there. So, but it was a solid city block that was fenced off.
DJ, then Rick.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I have a question for you that's going to lead me into another question. My question for now is, you know, the bulk of these regulations, whose regulations are those? Now, as an example, I can understand ADA, that's a large regulatory body that we have to comply with, but using other examples like, hey, the rubber tire thing, or those more menial regulations, who is regulating that? Where did the definitions come from?
They come from the Grants Pass Municipal Code.
Okay, very good. That's what I thought, but I wanted to get that out there. So, is it fair to presume that aside from the obvious, again using ADA as an example, the bulk of these things are under the jurisdiction and at the whim of council to adjust, correct?
Yes, I think public health is probably the main other one that I can think of, which is referenced in the code, which we would not regulate in terms of the safety aspect of the food and beverage. So that is obviously not ours. But other than that, yeah, I think you're right. The vast majority are under your purview.
Okay, yeah, thanks for bringing up that other example. So if I understand it correctly, we have ADA, health and safety, including fire and setbacks from different infrastructures like fire hydrants. Okay, thank you for clearing that up.
Yep.
Did you have a second question? Hang on, Joel. First, Aaron's been waiting a while, then Rick, then Joel.
To get back to Councilor Daly Grange's question with regards to fees, the mobile vending carts would have a fee of an original fee of a license and application of $320 with an annual renew of $150, and then there's a $10 background check also.
Thank you. Rick, then Joel.
So Brad, on these private lemonade stands, if you have a bunch of kids who want to put out a lemonade stand and they want to go on a corner, it's not their property, it's the neighbor's property, then they would have to go through this whole list of getting a license? Sorry.
I mean, especially garage sales are totally exempted. A one-time Saturday event type of thing, is exempted explicitly in the code. I think the intent, at least from community development perspective, is those that this is a ongoing business. It's an enterprise. So I certainly any other one-time events, we don't require permits for many of those kinds of things. So if you're just talking about a Saturday afternoon and sitting out there with a table, no.
Thank you.
Joel.
So Brad, have any cities done this with a zone that overlaid their parks? So like the softball fields or the swimming pool and the wading pool and things like that?
I think typically you're going to see those fall under a separate set of regulations for parks. There's just a lot of other factors to consider there, and you would usually have those separate. I think this type of solicitor or peddler license is really geared towards that more public vehicular oriented right away.
And we already have some of those other vendors like ice cream down by the wading pool and those type of vendors that
right.
that function very well. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Val.
Yeah, I guess my question comes down to, obviously, there was a complaint about the strawberry people. I was just kind of curious as to whether that came from the public or whether it was came from the city or where the complaints came from. Just curious.
I know that a CSO officer approached them, and they asked, well, what do I need to do? And that's when Aaron brought it up to the council. I don't know if police received a separate complaint that drew them to that, most likely, because they typically just respond to complaints. But.
Brian?
I would like clarity on that because I was under the impression that there was not a complaint and this was initiated by staff. So can we get clarity?
In the past, we have received complaints, whether it be a phone call or an email with regards to vending in some of the four-way stops of our city. This specific one, I'm not aware of. The complaint didn't come to me, but there may have been a complaint or something along those lines with this particular vendor, and this vendor then asked for the city to consider what we're talking about today.
Val?
So my question would be if they were to go and ask for permission from somebody who has a place on a whatever and got the approval from the people who had private to set something up and it was off the sidewalk, then would they be still required to do a business license and all that?
They would.
Okay.
Yeah, they would be the temporary merchant category. I mean, again, depending. I mean, if they're planning to do this, 5-7 days a week, then that's one thing. But yeah, but if they're on private property, there's a completely different definition in this municipal code for how those are regulated.
And it need to be in the appropriate zoning also.
Yeah.
Okay, which would be business park?
Commercial, maybe business park and industrial, but for sure commercial zones, not residential.
Okay. All right, thank
Yeah.
you.
All right, so I think really the question we have before us today, we have kind of this category that allows a license, but we don't have any appropriate zones. So I guess, council, you may want to consider establishing a zone or changing some of the other licensing, or we could just not allow this on sidewalks. And I think the alley issue is kind of a good question about downtown alleys, where there might be a little bit of space to do some business like this without being right in the middle of the walkway. DJ, go ahead.
Sure. So I have a couple suggestions. So whomever it is responsible for writing down these concerns, please pay attention. There's a few of them. So beginning with the definitions of vendor or peddler or merchant or food cart or whatever, I find those to be a little restrictive, a little too onerous. I think that would be a good step to start. And I'm not proposing a one-size-fits-all, but I think that's rather confusing. So I'd like to see that be simplified. And this is, as a general note, what I'm feeling about this being the first meeting. We need to simplify this. It's complex, it's onerous, and I just have a few ideas. So the definitions, let's clean those up. As far as the sidewalk vending zones as kind of the core issue that we're dealing with, I'm not too fancy on getting out a map and writing circles around everything and saying this is where you can have them and you can't. I would like to simplify that as well. As in council, just give general guidelines for what makes sense. What do we feel about what makes sense? And then anticipate the next meeting coming up with a map that highlights the areas that fall within the criteria that council puts forth. And then that way we can decide what would be appropriate for, quote unquote zones. Let's see. The regulations on signs and lighting needing to be attached to whatever vehicle, I think that could follow suit with the simplification of the definitions. I'm sure we can all envision a little A-frame sign sitting next to a food cart wouldn't be the worst thing, as long as it met the setback requirements that we were talking about. There's currently prohibiting generators for certain ones. Sometimes generators are necessary, but then I can understand a generator being bothersome to a business entrance or maybe like a grower's market or something like that. So that might be complicated to find out, okay, do we regulate decibels? What do we do for generators? But allowing generators for food trucks, we can get a little bit more, how do you say, I guess a bigger breadth of goods you could buy at these theoretical vendors or merchants or peddlers or whatnot. So let's see, the bottom of slide 12 says, if there's an application for driveways or business entrances or what have you, then that'll be at the discretion of council. In simplifying this whole thing, I would also like to see that there are generalized guidelines to take that a step between staff regulation and council. I think that this could be a simple enough issue where we wouldn't be seeing a lot of applications come across our dais, aside from maybe some special events. So look into that and see how we can't simplify that. Items on the ground, boxes, supplies, ice, coolers, what have you, I think that should be allowed as well. Let's use the strawberry vendor as an example. They could have a cooler on the ground adjacent that's not, theoretically bolted to whatever cart that they have, but they can also peddle cold beverages in the summer, for example. So let's loosen that one up. We don't want trash sitting around. So yes, having a wastebasket is definitely appropriate, but prohibiting boxes of goods or coolers of goods or anything, I think we should loosen that up. As far as slide 15 goes, I think having a little bit of information from other municipalities that have success with these kind of programs, I think we should look into that. I'm not typically in favor of just doing what other municipalities do. That being said, this is kind of a foreign territory for me at least, and I would like to see what other cities have to offer. For example, I know Medford has a pretty neat program. You can drive downtown and see street vendors or peddlers or merchants or whatever it is that they call them, or you can go all the way to Bangkok, Thailand, and you can see them absolutely everywhere. So the regulations are out there. I'd like to just get into a superficial view of what other municipalities are doing. So there's a accumulation of my ideas so far.
Okay, thank you. Other comment, Rob?
Yeah, thanks, DJ, for thinking that through so carefully. It's hard for me to have maybe an opinion on the entire city because I don't have really an intimate picture in my mind of every sidewalk in the city and every commercial zone in the city. The area that I'm very familiar with is the CBD, Central Business District. Until I, got this presentation, I didn't focus too much on this issue, and I was out of town for the weekend. Unfortunately, on Mondays, many of the restaurants are closed, so I didn't get a chance to talk to as many of the restaurant owners this morning as I would have liked to. But the few that I talked to, I'm going to give you some of their thoughts, people in the Central Business District. One person said that his business is his sole source of income. It's completely how he supports his family. He pays plenty in taxes, including the safety levy. And if any sidewalk vendor were within a block of his business, within the bounds of the law, he would make their life a living hell. So that's just one person's opinion. And I said to him, some counselors might like the idea. And he says, well, then they're idiots. And I said, well, I'll share your view, but I won't use your name. He says, please use my name. So anyone who wants to know the name after the meeting, I will share that. I had another person actually who wanted to be associated with it and wanted to use their name, and after the meeting she said that she was dumbfounded that anyone would consider such a stupid idea. That's another comment from a downtown stakeholder who has a food business. We have another one who said, and again, unfortunately, I didn't talk to as many as I would have liked to. Another one said that they didn't want any of these carts anywhere within 2 blocks of anyone's restaurant. So these are three different views. I feel the same way, owning a downtown business, one that has a food focus, a prepared food focus, and it's kind of, I don't know, ironic that in the presentation on the first page, one of the examples given was something that said healthy choices or something like that as a food cart, and I'm thinking, gee, where can we find healthy choices downtown? Maybe on D Street at True Juice, maybe at Sunshine and H Street. So it was almost like, oh, direct competition. How do I feel about that for someone that's paying a few $100 a year? I don't like the idea at all. I don't think it's fair. Years ago, when the food trucks were happening which may have prompted this last ordinance change, there were food trucks that literally would park for actually more than 3 hours in downtown parking spaces, parallel parking spaces. They would completely obscure storefronts. You could be driving down 6th Street, looking for a business, and not be able to see their sign at all. Not necessarily a restaurant, but not even be able to see the sign, which is what prompted my question earlier about, gee, could someone have their food cart right up against someone's window and block the window? But I don't think in the central business district, the one area that I'm probably qualified to have a decent opinion on, I personally think it's a terrible idea. 3 out of the 3 people I spoke with this morning felt the same way, basically from an unfair competition, or we'll say a low contribution from a financial standpoint, low competitor is unfair. So I don't see a huge plus in the downtown. I don't think it's fair to have very low low overhead competition right there, potentially right in front of your business. And there's pretty much a restaurant, at least a restaurant on every block. So even if you had a block buffer, it still basically would essentially preclude the CBD. Again, other areas in the city, maybe someone would have an example where it actually kind of almost makes sense or is a good idea or would serve the public in some way that isn't already served. I don't see it in the CBD.
Rob, a quick question, and then it's Brian, then Joel. What if a business was allowed to sell, like your business was allowed to have a food cart? Would you have a different opinion about it?
At the existing location where we're already paying taxes?
Yeah, just outside your business.
Well, people can have, the sidewalk seating, which is not that different. You're using up your space for, it's just basically allowing more square footage of signage, I guess. It would almost come under that in a certain sense. But people can already have a, sidewalk dining. I'd have to, think about that. That wasn't really what I was focusing on, because I don't think that that's what this presentation was focusing on. But it's a separate question.
It's true. It's not what the presentation's about. And in fact, strawberry vendors, I've never seen one downtown, but I think we had Brian.
We had that a few years, just 3-4 years ago.
Oh, did you?
There were fruit vendors downtown on the sidewalk.
Okay.
There was a guy that had a mini version of Daniel Boone's trading post along with fruit outside of the post office. I probably have pictures of that, actually. I can bring them. There was a guy, he literally had a mini Daniel Boone's trading post. It was fishing rods, sleeping bags, cast iron, whatever, and fruit. But that's all right around the same time as the food trucks were kind of creating an issue downtown. But we've had that, yeah.
Okay, I think I said Brian, then Joel, then Rick? Okay.
I'm going to take a step back on this whole topic because there's so many ins and outs and details and things, and honestly, to me, this is not a very important issue right now. This is not something that I feel like staff should be spending a lot of time on doing right now. This is not a pressing issue. This came up from staff. There was not a customer or a citizen complaint about this. So all of these details, it could take staff and council months and months to work through all this. And it's just not really an issue, honestly. That said, I appreciate DJ's comment about simplifying. I was going to say something similar. I was going to say, we can streamline this. I think it can be streamlined. I think one way it could be streamlined, if we really want to put more time into this, is to potentially, in that list of definitions, If we created another definition that was, say, like a day vendor definition, that could have a very streamlined process, because these other definitions don't necessarily fall under what we're trying to address here with the fruit vendors. I think that there maybe could be another definition that's super streamlined, that doesn't have to pay the hundreds of dollars in fees and do all these onerous regulations. And they're not, you know, they're trying to set up out of the way. They're trying to set up, they're not trying to be a nuisance. So I don't think that we and staff need to put hours and hours and months into this, because we have a lot more important things to do.
Joel?
Well, I also agreed not to proceed with the code amendment, and my logic is I don't really see at this point in time a demonstrated purpose and need. It's a little bit different words than Brian used, but it's the same substance. We do have the means for doing it on private land. We do have the means for doing it in the parks. We do have the means for doing it under special events. We do have Saturday morning market. We do have the fairgrounds where that happens. And so at this point in time to invest, you know, perhaps in the future, but that would be my gut feeling right now. Do not proceed with the code amendment.
Rick?
Further elaboration on that, when I look at an ordinance also, I try and see what other impact it could have on, for instance, existing businesses. So one of the things mentioned was the growers market. Do they have to, is each individual booth a business that has to have individually liability insurance? They have to go through a license with the city? Do they have to go through a background check? And I'm not saying that the answer needs to be there today, but I see, you know, how extensive would this ordinance be? Thank you.
Vanessa?
I would agree that this discussion got overly complicated really quickly. The real spirit of today's discussion is somebody who is attempting to make a livelihood in our community selling agricultural goods. And for anybody to say that their willingness to make a living is unimportant is a little disheartening. I would like the council to consider making an amendment in this code for an exception for the display of fruits and vegetables. And I would like us to discuss potentially allowing a blanket sidewalk vending zone in our general commercial business park and industrial with an exemption, with a restriction for the central business district. I would also like to see the potential discussion for their business fee and their business license fee to be reduced if they plan to sell fruits or vegetables in underserved areas of our community. For example, the northwest and the northeast part of town do not have a grocery store. So if they did decide, if they provided a site plan in those areas, I would like the consideration for their business fee to be reduced, potentially to the renewal cost, so as to incentivize the consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables.
All right, Valerie?
Yeah, I would agree this has gotten very, very, yeah, it's just like, wow, how many regulations can we throw? So I like DJ's idea of making something very simple. I like Vanessa's idea of making something very, you know, a very minor fruits, vegetables. I do understand the problem that you have with the sidewalks, ADA rules, getting by. But I do think there should be something added to the definition for simply a, I don't know, hourly, less than so many hours a day, so many times a month for fruits and vegetables to set up, because I do think it's kind of fun. I think another thing to think about, and I had someone else have this discussion with us when we were talking about the A Street property, and at one point in time we had talked about that being a site. Somebody had come in and talked about the fact that she'd love to sell flowers on that site, you know, and have that same sort of thing, a short little vending thing where she sold flowers, you know. So that would be a wonderful idea to do. I agree with Rob. I think the reason we shut down that discussion was, number one, the last thing we want to do is be competition for our downtown. But I do think that if we were to take that parking lot and relook at it as a means by which to create some sort of money down the road, having some sort of a vending permit and doing something there might be something to think about in the future, because I do think it would add some character to the town, and I don't think that it would be a threat to our downtown restaurants because they're pretty well established. So I think that's for a future discussion. The parking lot next door. In the meantime, I think something just very simple would be my suggestion.
DJ?
Yeah, thank you. Going back to what Rob was mentioning, first and foremost, I agree with you, Rob, and I appreciate that perspective of the downtown businesses. A little bit of a twist to that, in my mind, is the understanding of a little bit of healthy competition, a little bit of bolstering activity into, the downtown could theoretically help as well, and I'm sure you've thought about that, but I just wanted to add that to the conversation. We certainly don't want to topple our current restaurants with street vendors. So anyway, I'm tending to agree that we have important things to talk about. But my other sentiment is likened somewhat to Vanessa's, in that if we decide not to do anything today, at the very least, we need to maintain some sort of status quo, because, correct or not, there is an interpretation that has allowed street vendors that are making a living currently, and it would be inappropriate for us to pull that plug until we are capable of dealing with it. And if that requires a code change, I'm willing to make it. So I guess a general question would be, could we maintain a status quo until we're ready, honoring the obvious ones? You can't be in front of a fire hydrant. You have to honor ADA requirements. You need to maintain a reasonable public right-of-way for public access, those kind of things. And if the answer is no, then I think we should just, I don't know, quickly change something. I like the suggestion of agricultural goods, because that would maintain a status quo that we are aware of, but does that maintain the status quo for perhaps other vendors and their intentions otherwise for the season? Now the season is coming along. So if I could get that question answered, I do have another comment to follow through with. So that'd be for Aaron or Brad.
Okay, well, I think maintaining status quo might be hard right now, because this does specifically mention that we need to have a zone, and also that the zone needs to have 8-foot wide sidewalks, which probably only really exist in the downtown central business district, which is the exact area that we're talking about excluding. So, but I do think we've heard, maybe I've heard from at least 4 of you, some interest in establishing kind of a simple allowance for agricultural goods, which might include flowers or as well as produce. So I was thinking maybe if I get a quick head count of how many people would be interested in pursuing that, we could talk about this again another day.
Clarify that question. So does that include or exclude the CBD?
I think what most people have talked about as far as agricultural goods might be excluding. I don't know if you want to specify that, or...
I'm just thinking there's flower shops and grocery stores in the CBD, so the need for it to serve the public is not needed in the CBD. So I'm just trying to get a clarification of what you're proposing.
Excluding CBD? Okay, so let's say if we had staff work on drafting something, a provision to allow an agricultural stand that's outside of the CBD, but on public right away, because the private parking lots are a different provision. Is that something that you're interested in? I'm seeing, okay, I see Brian with a question. Was that
Well, I
also a
just-
support, or?
It's support, but I just wanted to clarify, I think it's an important distinction to use the term right-of-way instead of sidewalk, because a lot of the vendors are not on sidewalk, they're just behind the sidewalk, but still within the right-of-way. Like, I know there's one a few blocks from my house that is in that situation, and I think pretty much all of them that I've seen are in the right-of-way, but not on the sidewalk, so I think that's fine. I think an allowance for that would be fine.
Okay, and DJ, you say you have your hand up. Is your hand up in support of that?
Yeah, I appreciate your suggestion. The agricultural goods, yeah, that would be a quick, easy change. And in maintaining the status quo for locations, they have good, let's just use the strawberry vendors, because I think this is the poster child example. You know, Union, D Street, Agnes, et cetera, those are good locations, and I don't think they've bothered anybody. So some little quib about, I don't know if those locations are okay or whatnot, but they wouldn't currently meet that width requirement. So Sarah, if you could, or somebody, just propose something that we could maintain the status quo as much as possible. My other comment was that here soon, hopefully we're going to be having that conversation about vendors and such in the parks, Riverside Park, et cetera. I think that this is part and parcel to that conversation. And it would be nice if it is part and parcel to that conversation that we kind of wrap this up in that conversation, but try not to get muddled in all this bureaucratic busy work. So thanks.
Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one further clarification. It was my impression that maybe we would be looking at vendors that have, that are selling raw agricultural goods, like, you know, fresh produce and flowers, and not, DJ mentioned like cookies and jams, which is more of a finished product. And I wasn't under the impression that we would be allowing that.
Okay, well, I guess is that the understanding that we're talking about kind of raw goods here? I'm seeing heads nod. Okay, so raw agricultural products. What about cut fruit, like a snack? That, I mean, that kind of falls into a hot dog stand, prepared foods, or are we just talking agricultural produce, flowers? Okay, people are nodding that they're really just thinking. Okay, so let's pursue that for now, and they can change it in the future, because obviously we're going to have another discussion about this, but it sounds like there's some interest in making an allowance that's kind of easy for agricultural sales.
We will definitely move forward with that. The one thing I do want to provide, though, is I'm not sure if there's an easy to that, because whether it's just agricultural use or if it's street vending open in general, there still needs to be the same guidelines established for us to have an understanding of where it's allowable and where it's safe. So we'll bring something forward to you, but to cut it down to something that's easy is difficult. We have a picture in some of the areas that have been mentioned on the dais today that are in areas that really are not conducive to the spirit of what a sidewalk vendor is. A sidewalk vendor is there for pedestrian traffic. And the majority of the sites that we've talked about today are vehicular traffic, which is already against one of our codes of having money money transaction between car and pedestrian. So there are a number of issues where you see them today, they, even with something quick or easier, would still not be allowed in those areas due to some of our already current codes that we have in place. Because of the obvious things. There's safety issues. We don't want to impede traffic or have those individuals in the right-of-way in the streets to exchange money and currency, et cetera. So we'll bring something to you, but I just wanted to give you, it's going to have a lot of what we talked about today in it, and it has to, in order for us to have something that's enforceable and clear. This is a very complex issue, and likely one of the reasons why it wasn't addressed in 2016 is it is going to take some time to develop something that's safe for everyone.
DJ.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. You actually addressed the point of clarification that I wanted to make, specifically regarding enforcement and locations. And I'm going to try to ask this again in I guess the clearest possible way. My goal here would be to maintain status quo until we are prepared to address this. And I want to do whatever it takes to ensure that that status quo is maintained, because it's no fault of these vendors that we are not prepared to accommodate these ordinances. And as Vanessa said before, we cannot be messing with their livelihood accordingly. So what is it exactly, Aaron, that you believe that we should do so that you guys can be comfortable from a regulatory and enforcement perspective and still maintain the current allowed status quo?
So we will maintain the current status quo. We're complaint driven, and based on that, we will continue to do so. And so there's no changes currently right now to the code. There are certain things that are allowed and not allowed, and currently this type of vending that you're talking about is not identified as an allowable use in any zone until such time it would be illegal, but it's only on a complaint-driven status.
Vanessa?
Okay.
To follow up to that, do you know the punishment for this activity? Is it just a violation? Okay, thank you.
These usually end up with an actual no citation or violations written. They're all just basically warnings, and they move on.
Thank you.
Val, did you still have something?
I just was thinking, my brain is going around just like everybody else's is thinking, well, where would that be a location? And I think to myself of how much, it all comes down to traffic issues and traffic safety. And I look at things like the Grants Pass Shopping Center that has 18 million spots that they could probably set up if they were to work with them. Or, that's what I was trying to think, is in the sense, there probably are some private people that they could talk to about setting up a spot where it's not a traffic hazard. Because on that corner of the four-way stop where we've seen them, I can see that there being a problem with people stopping to park around that area. But if they were to do it in an area where there was parking nearby, it would be much easier for everybody involved. So, those are the kind of zones per se that we're looking at. But I would agree right now with DJ that it's pretty convoluted to go out there and get all those right now. So I would keep it status quo, but that is something in the future that we need to define as those zones and see and go around and see, because there are places that you could have them where there's parking nearby. And that's the problem that I've seen with where they are now, is that is a safety concern. So anyway, so I think we should move forward to try to find some of those zones to help. But in the meantime, keep the status quo and see how it goes.
Brian?
I agree with DJ and Valerie. Maintaining status quo and having it be complaint driven as we have in years past has worked fine, and I'm good with that.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on from this topic, right? All right, next up, urban campground contract.
Well, good afternoon, Mayor, Council. I'm filling in for Augustus today. He is a little under the weather, so I'm going to be going through the presentation for you and answering what questions I can. There is a Rogue Retreat representative also present to answer any questions associated with that. As you're aware, we've been working on a contract, and Council's provided us with a number of direction items, and hopefully the spirit of those have been shown here in the contract that you have in front of you. And the city also did meet with Rogue Retreat last week and got some additional comments and wanted to go through those with you today. And those items will be highlighted in yellow, and they're in yellow on your in your contract sheet, which is the latest changes based on what we received from Rogue Retreat as their comments for moving forward with the partnership. Some of the things council's already determined is that we were going to utilize some state designated dollars of up to $1 million to help purchase a property and or a grant for the purchase of property for an urban campground in association with a partnership with the All Care Community Foundation. The dollars would be primarily for an urban campground with a primary focus of at least 6 years maintaining some form of an urban campground service level. And the contract would allow for All Care Community Foundation to sell the real property in the future with the caveat that all proceeds are reinvested into affordable housing in Grants Pass. That contract represents the spirit of that. It also allows a third party to subcontract out specialized services if necessary, above and beyond what we see as the original urban campground, or they can, All Care Community Foundation can contract with Rogue Retreat to provide those services. That the services provided for the urban campground would be consistent with all applicable industry standards, and that the contract is for capital resources, not for any operations or administration of the urban campground. So moving into some of the things that were discussed last week that are represented here for you, for your consideration, are some changes that are highlighted in yellow. We'll just start from the beginning of the contract, and I'll highlight some of the larger pieces that came out of our conversation with Rogue Retreat. The first is in paragraphs 1, which is the definitions. Some of this is something that council discussed also. 1.2, capital improvements, and the definition of what capital improvements is, along with 1.5, urban campground. And what does an urban campground mean from a definition? Moving on into paragraph 4, timeline regarding the dissemination of funds to grantee. One of the things council suggested was if we can have a quick turnaround time once something is identified. And this was a theme also discussed with Rogue Retreat. We discussed a 30-day time frame would be appropriate for both parties. Once the grant is provided, the city would ultimately have that transaction occur within the 30-day time period. So moving on to paragraph 6, this is one that's going to require some additional comments from council. This is newer on the subject list, and this pertains to the buffer zones. Now, originally from some community forums that we had and discussions that council had, the community and All Care Community Foundation and the city sort of agreed that a 1,000-foot buffer from schools in general would be something that we'd look at, and that excludes daycare. We have other buffers for that, but specifically for schools, a 1,000-foot buffer would be established. In looking at the way the properties are zoned and their relations to schools, one of the things the All Care Community Foundation is asking for in order to help broaden their ability to look at additional sites, because finding a site is relatively difficult in Grants Pass, is that council consider changing some of the buffers. So what they'd like is they'd still like to have a 1,000-foot buffer from established commercial zones, shorten that 7 to 750 feet buffer in business park, 500 feet in industrial. So the reason and the rationale for that perspective is, in general, zoning in the state of Oregon provides buffers themselves. Normally a strict industrial zone is not contiguous to a residential zone. It's contiguous to either a high-use commercial or a business park. Business park is usually surrounded by and not attached to or contiguous to residential. Commercial can be attached or contiguous to residential along with business park or other commercial uses. So in general, the state of Oregon already has a defined buffer area when it comes to uses. If they are able to find a piece of property in an industrial zone, the idea was, because of the zoning buffers that are already in existence for the state of Oregon, that maybe council would consider changing the feet requirement from specific zones. So this is something for your consideration that they'd like, and we would need additional feedback on, that they may be coming to you once a site is identified. Under paragraph 8, grantee to purchase real property. This is really upon future sale of the real property, that real property, once it was sold, the restrictive covenants would go away. Say, for instance, All Care Community Foundation finds a piece of property and they purchase the property, they operate it for 8 years as an urban campground, and then recognize that maybe there's another piece that's more suitable, or a different use that fits within the affordable housing definition is more suitable. They'd like to sell that piece and go buy another piece. What this would allow is it would allow, if they sold this piece and they bought a new piece, the covenant would go away from that piece of property as long as the covenant was carried forward to the new piece of property that they purchased. So there would still be a piece of property associated with the covenant for the use of affordable housing. Under paragraph 10, this really adds excluding the appraised value of any capital improvements made upon the real property by receipt other than those improvements paid by the city. And ultimately what this is there to try to make sure that any investments associated with the capital improvements would be made whole by Rogue Retreat. Following in the contract, paragraph 11, this would be a new restrictive covenant for any new real property for affordable housing. That's there sort of with what I talked about when it came to the 8.1 section. Under paragraph 12, termination for convenience. This one just adds the city will have the option and sole discretion to terminate this agreement any time during the term thereof for convenience and without cause upon not less than 90 days written notice to grantee. This was something that council did discuss earlier. Paragraph 15. One of the things that was discussed in their meeting last week was Rogue Retreat would like to see intentional when it comes to intentional acts and not just acts in general. So intentional was added as a consideration for council. Under paragraph 17, grantee remedies for termination, another little bit of language here that was suggested to be added by Rogue Retreat was the appraised cost of any capital improvements made upon the real property by the grantee. Again, this goes back to making sure that the All Care Foundation would be made whole if the city did terminate and they put on, say, a shower facility or some other kind of facility that's worth $250,000, that they would get that back if the city did take over the property. So your call to action is at council's discretion. Ultimately, this contract is related to a potential grant once All Care Community Foundation has identified a piece of property for potential purchase. You can approve the draft contract. You can provide direction that the draft contract is within the spirit of where you're going, or you can provide us to direct any kind of alterations to the contract. As long as we have this contract prepared for when a future site is identified, that's the key that will match up. And if we can have it in advance, that would be best. So with that, Mayor, Council, I turn it over to you.
DJ, then Brian, then Rob, then Rick.
Thank you for the modifications and the presentation. My question is about the stipulation of in the future, after that 6 years, the All Care Foundation would have the liberty to liquidate the assets and put it towards, quote unquote, affordable housing. And I'm paraphrasing here. Is that well defined, or is that basically encapsulate that covenant?
Well, I think it's relatively, I don't know what you'd consider well-defined, but it does provide for the foundation to operate it for 6 years as an urban campground. And then anything after that, they could transition that piece of property to, say, a higher use or a better use is deemed appropriate by the foundation, as long as it is in association with the definition of what affordable housing is.
Okay, and the follow-up question is, I understand that we're putting some regulations around this initial 6-year investment. After that 6-year investment, is it fair to presume that there are no longer any stipulations coming from the city, unless, of course, it's an urban campground? I guess the latter part of my question is not appropriate. Is it fair to presume that after the 6-year period of time, when All Care would have the contractual liberty to liquidate the asset, that the city would not have any say in how that money would be spent?
The foundation, after the 6-year period, could, at their discretion, determine that there is potentially a better or higher use for that property, as long as it meets the definition of affordable housing, is sort of the way this contract reads.
Okay, without outside jurisdiction of the city or any regulatory or constrictions otherwise that we're placing for the first 6 years.
Yeah,
maybe I'm not asking this.
I don't
maybe
think
I'm not asking the question correctly. Is my question confusing?
There's not a clause for mutual consent on the property after 6 years and its use, except for that it just follows the broad definition of affordable housing.
Okay, so using this as an example, because that helps me wrap my mind around these things. After 6 years, that money is, in effect, the proper investment, we should say. That investment is then, in effect, the sole property of All Care Foundation, and the only stipulation is that it's used for quote-unquote affordable housing in the community.
That is correct, and the value is still there within the piece of property that ultimately was a grant of whatever the dollar amount is. That value is still there for affordable housing. So your original investment is always in place. Even if they sold the property and reinvested it in a new piece, that new piece would then, in order for that to happen, would then, if the city was to agree, would have to have that also on the deed restriction.
Okay, that answers that question, and I have one more. And I'm sure this has been addressed before, but I'm just trying to have crystal clarity at this point. So currently the money is to be used for, general regulations, urban campground, affordable housing, et cetera. What about operating costs or capital improvements that might be necessary for an urban campground, including sewer laterals and water service and, those kind of different things? Is that an allowed use for this money?
So, according to the state, that $1 million is allowed for affordable housing. So, for instance, if there was some additional infrastructure that was needed, as long as it was geared towards affordable housing, then that would be an allowable use, even if it was to pay system development charges for a property that was undeveloped, or some additional capital outlay associated with the property in order to get it ready for to utilize as an urban campground. That would all be an allowable use under the state guidelines for the $1 million that we have received.
Okay, I understand that from the allowed utilization of this money from the state, but now taking into consideration the constraints, if you will, that council is putting on the allowable use of the money, the same question is asked: are operating expenditures and infrastructure, capital improvements, can they spend this money on that, or is it just property acquisition?
So ultimately, that's for council to determine. This contract.
I'm basically asking what has council decided on that.
Well,
issue. I think that's.
Yeah, the spirit of this contract is that it would be in conjunction with a grant for the purchase of real property.
So,
DJ,
I'm sorry, for the sake of crystal clear clarity, the money is for acquisition of property, but not capital improvements and operation costs? This is my last question.
Correct.
Now, I promise.
It definitely doesn't address operations. Now, if some of the capital costs associated with the original purchase of the property, I think that could comply with the grant request. And ultimately, that's council's decision on that. But if, say for instance, I'll give an example, they found a piece of property for $750,000 and they wanted to put $250,000 of infrastructure associated with an urban campground, that can all be lumped into the grant, and this contract would be able to address that grant.
DJ, do you have
Okay, that clarifies my questions. Thank you.
do you have a copy of the grant agreement, not just the slideshow?
I believe I have an old one, but no, I don't have one in front of me.
Okay, we'll make sure that somebody sends you a new one. We have one here on the dais, and I think you'll see that affordable housing is defined, and it is also defined in section 7 that the funds would be for the purchase of real property. So it's fairly clear, I think, in my opinion, that it's for the purchase of the property and not for operations. But we need to make sure you get an updated copy of the grant agreement. Okay. Back to my list. I have Brian, then Rob, then Rick.
Thank you. Also, to tack on to what you just said, Sarah, Section 3 talks about limitations regarding the use of funds, and it says this agreement will be limited to purchasing and improving suitable real property. So it's detailed in Section 3. I would venture to say that I am more well-versed in this contract than anyone in this room, and including Aaron and including Augustus. And my question is, I actually have a whole list of questions. My first question is, why is the contract we're reviewing today, and why is the slideshow we have today different than the one that was sent to us on Friday? There is new contract language in here from the one we were sent Friday. This slideshow is not the slideshow we were sent Friday. Why?
So again, Augustus is not here today. He's sick. So and I was off on Friday. So in coming in today, I recognized that there was a missing piece in the contract and presentation that specifically was the setbacks, the buffer zone that was discussed. And we did mention to Rogue Retreat that we were going to bring this forward for your consideration because this was something of interest to theirs. So I updated the rest of the presentation and the contract based on the discussion that we had last week.
With who?
With Rogue Retreat. Excuse me, it's All Care. With All Care Community Foundation, sorry.
Okay, but council didn't provide any direction to put this language into the draft contract.
That is correct. This is a draft contract, and we put this in there for your consideration to try to address their needs. As we mentioned, we were going to provide you a draft that incorporated the spirit of what All Care Community Foundation wanted, and that's what we mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation. And so this just represents feedback from All Care Community Foundation and what their desire was, and it's all for council consideration.
I appreciate that feedback from All Care. I don't appreciate it being put in here at the last minute without notification. I have not been satisfied with staff's work on this contract and the handling of this contract. And at some point today, I would like to go through the contract section by section like we did last time, because I have about 12 sections that need addressed. So at some point, let's do that.
So, Counselor, I appreciate that. Staff's intent was to give you a comprehensive look at where we are, providing you the information that we have with regards to All Care Community Foundation's desires for the contract to help move this along as successfully and quickly as possible. I am not an attorney, even though I play one on TV. And so, knowing that I'm not an attorney, I did ask the mayor and council president if this should be delayed because the attorney is not here to go through the items. I'm here stepping in just to provide the presentation for you, but if you've got specific contract language, it would probably be appropriate to wait and have that discussion once the city attorney is present.
I disagree, and I would like to discuss it today so we can move this forward, and you can take notes and you can discuss it with Augustus after the meeting.
Did you have more questions? Okay. Rob?
That's a hard comment to follow, but I agree. It is really disappointing that we had so much time. Like, in other words, had the staff gotten this aspect of it just a couple days earlier, then we would have had this on Friday, the current copy on Friday, and we would have been able to scrutinize it better. So, I mean, we all know in this room that this is and has been a very top priority for everyone in town. So to miss a deadline by a few hours or a day of sending us out so we can have a meaningful discussion today is just not a good job on staff's part. Sorry. But I do have a question also. A couple places in here, at least one place, 11.2, where it says all proceeds realized from future sale of real property, I guess have to be reinvested. I'm not sure. There may be a legal definition of proceeds, but if you actually look in a dictionary, proceeds can mean it can mean the gross or the net, and there's no definition here of what that means. So that needs to be clarified. And again, maybe there's a legal understanding of what proceeds means, but if you look in the dictionary, it's not at all clear what that means.
Any other questions?
We just need that clarified, is my point. What does proceeds actually mean, gross or net?
Okay, we can work that in for the next draft. Do you have a suggestion?
Well, I think that the council needs to think about it. I mean, if a property, what I'm thinking is if a property were to double or triple in value in X number of years, then there could potentially, depending on how proceeds is defined, there could be motivation for All Care Foundation to want to sell it and move on to another property that they get a screaming deal on. So, in other words, we've got financial considerations there depending on how that is defined, how proceeds is defined. So I'd rather, to me, I think proceeds should probably mean the gross, meaning everything it's sold for, including any appreciation, then gets reinvested, so that there's really no motivation for All Care to try to make a profit in the deal. And again, I'm not accusing All Care of doing anything. I'm just trying to keep honest people honest.
Rick?
I do have a question before I get into that, though. I think it's important that the council have current information, and I'm supportive that staff has brought this information to us today for that very purpose. I mean, it could have been postponed, but I think it's important to keep things moving. So going back on slide 6, when it talks about the different buffers,
Yes.
I just have a suggestion. I didn't know if it lends clarity when it's stated, like for instance, 6.1.1, 1,000 foot buffer, if established, and add the words in a commercial zone. I didn't know if that'd be appropriate or not, but that makes it a little clearer to me. It's just a suggestion. Thank you.
Let's see, I think I'm on Vanessa.
Is the representative from All Care Community Foundation here to speak? Are you able to answer a question if I have one? Sure. Okay. From the presentation and grant agreement, brand new to us today that we've received, in paragraph 12, there is a termination clause to terminate at any time for convenience and without cause. The council gave direction for this to be removed, but according to this presentation, All Care Community Foundation has requested that this is brought back. Can you explain why?
We did not request it to be brought back. On section 12.
Jed, can you make sure your mic's on?
Okay. Does this?
That's good, yeah.
Section 12 is. Okay.
Silver button, it turns red.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Section 12 defines a termination by the city for convenience. There are other sections in there for termination for cause. We objected to the termination for convenience and asked that it be removed. So if that's not what was in the notes, that doesn't reflect our request. We have requested that Section 12, the termination for convenience by the city, that it be removed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was also my recollection that we had removed it. Is that what you had in your notes, Vanessa?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was only asking because according to the presentation today, it's signifying that All Care Community Foundation requested that that is brought back. So I just wanted clarification from All Care. Thank you very much.
Okay. Joel?
So on that, I'll need to hear from the city lawyer and see what the business law is and the case precedent in that and what we need to do. The other thing I'd like to ask All Care was under 9.2, it seems to me like a grantee will provide an urban campground in a transitionally focused manner consistent with applicable industry standards, including case management. Would you have any objections to putting in there case management?
No, our intention is that we will handle the purchase of the property. We will arrange and install things like sewer and other facilities. We would be installing asphalt parking lots so that cars could be parked on that site. The operations would be handled by Road Retreat, which is the same thing as case management.
Right.
And we would contract with them to provide that service.
Sure, and then maybe 9.2 isn't the place it needs to go, but it seems like in the contract that would be something that you'd want direction and you intend to provide anyway, and it's something that we need in an urban campground operated to standards, that we'd have case management for mental health, for substance abuse, for all those things that are needed.
Well, that was clearly our intent, and we thought in the review when we looked at it last week that it communicated our intent to do a contract with Road Retreat to provide case management.
Sure, so we could put it in there and you wouldn't object to that?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
It'd be Road Retreat or equivalent. I mean, there are ways we can do other suppliers than Road Retreat, but we would identify a case management and contract them with them to provide service.
One of the things I think we need to do is make sure we have our lawyer present and ask him questions. I would assume that in terms of that article, terminations and remedies, number 12, that for some reason he put that in there, and we need to know why, and go from there.
Okay.
Vanessa?
To be clear, Councillor King, in the copy that Augustus had sent us on Friday, that was not in there.
All right, yeah, that's something that dates back to our initial contract that we passed and then I vetoed last year, and that was actually partly the reason why I vetoed it, although it was overly complicated in a number of ways. I had a question on 1.5 urban campground. I just wanted us to include pallet shelter. Since we're mentioning a number of other ways in which people might be housed, I didn't want to exclude that one. Brighton.
So with regards to clause 12, it's my understanding that All Care would not be willing to proceed with that clause in there. I wouldn't proceed with that clause in there if I were them. If the rug could just be pulled out from under them at any point for no reason because of the whim of a future council, I certainly would not agree to that. So, and council has previously given direction to take that out. So this doesn't work with that in there, regardless of what anybody says. Is now an appropriate time to go through the contract like we did last time to address, because going through a slideshow when the slideshow is for the contract is a little bit silly. We should just have the contract up there and not the slideshow. So are we going to move forward on this today, or are we going to defer again?
Well, we are going to need to address this one again, obviously, but I think if you have suggestions of things that you want added, we should get that out there now.
I certainly do, and I think that doing it after the fact is not going to be as effective because council will need to weigh in on these. So me addressing them with Aaron privately, there's no point to that. So if we could have the contract up on the screen and go through it, that would be fantastic.
I did actually have a question, and you can go ahead and get up there and get the contract, but I just had a question. The question I had to do with when we mentioned them adding something to the property, and it comes down to the $1 million that we know up front, you know, depending on how much they paid for it, if there's money left over, they could use it, whatever, and I kind of understood that part of it. But if there was extra things added on and we decided to use some other funding, would that have to be approved by council? I guess that was my question, is if they had bigger pieces that they were adding on after the purchase of the property, because this is kind of written as for the purchase of the property. So my question was, because we were talking about giving them the money back for the capital improvements that they had added. So my question was, when they add the capital projects, will they have to be approved by council or not? I'm just curious.
No, it does not show. This contract is not associated with operations. So the operations, adding capital items associated with the operations is All Care Community Foundation's call.
Okay.
And so it's not something that council has to approve.
Okay, thank you.
Say, Sarah?
Joel?
So Brian, I appreciate your expertise in law. You're not a lawyer. I don't know, I assume that you've taken business law as I have as well. There's precedent in the courts.
Joel?
This is not the first time we did it, and for us to go through here and spend our time as a council without our lawyer being present, I would encourage you to mark it up, and I know you have before. Article 12 obviously needs to be discussed. Give it to the lawyer. Give it to our lawyer. It's a lawyer client. You're his client, and then let's get back and let's talk about it. For us to go through today, I've taken business. I've enforced a lot of contracts. I put people in breach of contracts. I've had a tremendous amount of experience in contracts, and when you get to this stage. This is our first contract with the city, for us to sit up here and think we're legal experts is not appropriate. And I appreciate your legal expertise.
Okay. We don't need to make this personal. Let's continue to talk about the contract instead of squabbling with each other. Rob, did you have something?
I did have a question, and now so is it correct to assume, following up on what Valerie was asking, so it's the city is providing a grant for the purchase of the property, and then any capital improvements, the foundation basically will choose, I guess, to essentially spend their own money on, but if and when that property ever gets sold, the city will then have to reimburse them. So they lay it out, we reimburse at some point potentially, right? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Brian, can you please tell us what your suggested changes are?
Sure. Section 1.5, which you just talked about, the urban campground definition.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, all of this is being recorded on video, so Aaron and Augustus can review this video, and I would encourage them to review this video to get all up to speed on this discussion and have clarity. So on 1.5, the definition of urban campground, Council did not give direction to modify that. That was modified independent of council direction from the original one that we had been working with, provided by Mark Bartholomew, the former city attorney. If there's a good reason why that was done, I would like to know. And if there's not, then I would prefer us to keep the original definition that we were working with.
Do you have a copy of what that definition was?
It is in, I believe, the first original draft that we were working with. I don't have it with me today, but
Okay.
it did include verbiage about tiny homes, which this does not.
Okay. And what's the next item?
Section 4, with regards to dissemination of funds, it's up a little. Section 4, yeah. So that 30 days, previously we had discussed, and actually Rob brought up the point of whether or not, or actually he asked staff if what they would consider to be the shortest reasonable time period by which the funds could be dispersed, because it's my understanding that we already have these funds, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so it's just a matter of the contract getting signed, and there's no need for a waiting period. Basically, staff can turn this around in a much shorter than 30-day period, and Augustus and Aaron, we're going to discuss that to see what the shortest reasonable period would be, and I don't know if that was discussed, because it certainly seems that it could be shorter than 30 days. So has that discussion taken place?
Yeah, we did discuss it, and we could have, I mean, if it's an emergency clause, we can have a check cut the next day. So it just would require a different process than what we normally do. We normally cut checks on Fridays, and depending on when we get notice, et cetera. So reasonable time would be 14 to 30 days based on workload and everything. But technically, if we needed to cut a check tomorrow, we can cut a check tomorrow. We can make it happen.
Okay. So seeing as this has been a council priority for a year and a half, in theory, this could be a 15-day and not a 30, pretty easily.
It will be whatever council wants it to
within
be.
a FERS.
I'll let you know we can't do it.
Okay.
Within a FERS, it could be less than that.
And this seemed reasonable when you met with ACCF last week, the 30 days?
Yes.
Okay. Let's move on to the next one.
Okay, 6.3. Real property will be at least 200 feet from recreational facilities and parks. Council has given direction that that is 300 feet, and I've actually already corrected staff on this once before, and I'm frankly amazed that it's not corrected yet. So that should be 300 feet on 6.3.
Okay.
Section 8. Upon city approval of the proposed purchase sale agreement, this is minor, but recipient is misspelled. 8.1. The last line states the form of the covenant is attached as Exhibit A. I have seen no attachment, so I'm not quite sure what that's referring to. 8.2, I would request further clarification on. I'm not totally sure what that 8.2 section means. 9.2.1. This is another minor thing, but in that 9.2.1, the words gender identity should probably be added. 10.1. Uh, 10.1 is along the same lines as Section 12. It says that the city can unilaterally just decide to terminate this agreement. So that goes along with Section 12. And I would assume that if we remove Section 12, this would be removed as well, because it kind of says the same thing. The next line, Section 10.2, a material breach by either the city or the grantee. the fact that the city is listed, like the way this is worded is if the city commits a material breach, the contract will be voided and we would be able to take the land back for $1, which makes absolutely no sense. So we could essentially, you know, not that we would, but in theory, the city could commit a breach and take that back. So that is just not good language and needs to be fixed. 11.2. I think Rob brought this one up, and this is just something to consider. It says reinvested into affordable housing in the city of Grants Pass. I'm not sure if that includes the urban growth boundary or not, but if it doesn't, we may want to consider just adding the urban growth boundary to that particular clause. We've already addressed section 12. Section 14.1. Section 14.1 is irrelevant because the funding to the city has already been obtained, so that does not need to be in there. 14.2 talks about if there's a change in federal or state law that would not allow the grantee to continue services under this agreement. I think we should consider adding a line in there stating that if that particular situation does arise, instead of us taking the property back, we would allow All Care to forego the 6-year period and just roll the investment into affordable housing sooner than that period. So that would be a discussion point for council at some point. And then the last one is section 17. And this is the section where it talks about, if I'm understanding correctly, it talks about the repayment of improvements if the property is taken back. And I think council needs to have further discussion on that and provide more clarity. But I don't know that we need to do that at this particular moment. And I will stop there. That's all I have. Thank you.
What's the last one, the last section number that you had?
17.
Thank you.
DJ.
Oh my, yeah, I've had my hand up for quite some time. It seems that we're divisive currently on whether or not we should talk about this. And to prevent any one counselor from commandeering this discussion, I'd like to make a motion to defer this discussion until next week.
Is there a second? Valerie with the second. All right, any discussion on that? Okay, DJ, you made the motion. How do you vote?
Yes.
Val?
Yes.
Vanessa?
We do not have a workshop next week, no.
Joel?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Rob?
No.
Brian?
I have a question. If this is passed, are we going to have a special meeting? Because the motion specifically said next week. So I can't vote right now. I will abstain, I guess.
And
Next workshop. How about the next workshop? Is that clear enough?
Then I retract my abstention and vote yes.
all right, hang on. Let's do one motion at a time here. Kurt?
Yes.
All right. I think that passed anyway. I lost track of the count there, but I think it was 5 to 2 to 1. Do you happen to know, Karen?
You are correct. And also Kurt does have his hand up.
Okay. And Kurt has his hand up. Go ahead, Kurt.
I was just saying yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I can't see the computer, so I don't know when people are doing things on Teams. Okay, well, it passed to next week, but DJ, you wanna say that we'll do it the following week?
Yes. We'll do it the following week.
Okay, oh, we don't know. Okay, so I think everybody agrees in the spirit there that we're okay with doing it the following week rather than a special meeting next week. Okay. Okay, thank you. And we are done with urban campground for today, but we have some things for the attorney to take a look at when he gets back to work. Agenda review. So next Monday is Memorial Day. We do not have a workshop, but we do have a business meeting where we have a public hearing to adopt the supplemental budget. We have a council action item that's a resolution for the purchase of equipment at West Home Park. A resolution to, that one moved, sorry. A resolution to consider, or we're going to hear from our fire department anyway, on whether or not there's anticipated to be a red flag warning for the 4th of July. A resolution to reallocate funds for a URA project. A resolution to provide a Bragg grant to the Bohemian Bar and Bistro. A resolution approving commercial activity in Riverside Park for the Fabulous 50s Car Show. A resolution that would contract with Southern Oregon Aspire for park janitorial services. A resolution that would award a pavement repair contract for Baker Park. A resolution for CIS general insurance renewal. And then an acknowledgement of the quarterly financial report with a presentation, and appointing a couple members to the CEDC, Collaborative Economic Development Committee, I think, and appoint Bikeways Pathways Advisory Committee members as well. Any questions about next week's meeting? All right, and then we have a workshop on June 6th where we're going to add this urban campground to continue. And then we have a couple of different topics regarding cell phone towers and design standards and where small cell towers could be located, as well as an update conversation about Caveman Pool and where we want to go with the design of that new pool. And any questions about that? Val?
Actually, I was going to go back to, I think we had a discussion the other day when we were talking about fireworks red flag. We also talked about the importance of bringing up any new things that are coming along from emergency management regarding fire. So we did have that discussion. I don't know, I don't see it anywhere on here. And
we haven't had an agenda setting meeting since last
You
Wednesday.
haven't, okay. So I just wanted to say that I think it's really important that we have that discussion sooner than later in terms of emergency. And I do know that, you know, there've been a lot of concerns. I think, I can't remember whether it's Ward or Nathan who talked about a lot of the fire concerns by the railroad tracks as well, and up on Dollar Mountain. So I don't know if that could be addressed in the fireworks red flag part. But anyway, I just wanted, those were some issues I want to make sure they get on the agenda.
Okay, DJ?
Sure, I understand we haven't had an agenda setting meeting, but public safety, we need to pay attention to that being on the list basically immediately. I understand, though, next Wednesday there is the collaboration effort brought forth by Joel on Wednesday and Thursday. So keep me privy to how that meeting's happening, because I'm scheduled for the next agenda setting meeting. That being said, I am curious as to when we can expect contractually obligated quarterly reports from our DMO. That would include TLT revenue, metrics, plan, et cetera. I think we're behind that. And, you know, I think it's time to demonstrate our expectation to them that we're overdue for a quarterly report. Let's see. That's two things. Three things is the Hillcrest Fire Station. I would like to either have a workshop or some decisiveness on council's part. That is an issue that will take all but a decision to approve, and we can find out what's what else is wrong with that building? I would like to support basically the consultation about that building as came out of strategic planning again. So I'm not proposing the exact way that we move forward, but this is a very easy thing that would take a quick discussion to decide and would be a set it and forget kind of a deal. So those three things, please.
Okay, yeah, we don't have Jason or Fire Chief here today. I don't recall where we're at on the Hillcrest Fire Station exactly, but we can sure look into that and see where we're at.
Oh, sure. I didn't have any expectation at all to get answers or a discussion today. I just wanted to make sure that.
Yeah, I feel like the wheels are turning on that one. I just don't remember exactly where we're at. I'm not sure that it's something that needs a workshop, but maybe just check in and let you know what's going on with that, because I don't recall. Okay. Anything else? Vanessa?
Yeah, in light of recent news of the Marine deputy resigning with the Josephine County Sheriff's Office and no plans of a replacement, I would like the council to hold a workshop on a procurement of a boat for Grants Pass Fire Rescue and overall enhancement of our swiftwater rescue program.
Okay, maybe we can roll that conversation into emergency management.
I don't know that it necessarily pertains to emergency management. I see that as being evacuation routes and possibly a Cascadia event discussion.
Okay, did you have something on that, Val?
Oh, I was just going to add to talk to DJ that I do know that Tori was planning on coming in June because that was part of her contract, so it just hasn't been scheduled. She's well aware of the fact that in her contract she needs to put forth a report in June.
Joel?
Just a point of order, usually it takes 3 counselors, whether it's Hillcrest Fire Station or the law enforcement funding, we already got that.
It doesn't have to take 3.
Well, then, what I was thinking if it just takes 1, our agenda is really going to, I mean, the rules are there for a reason. And it's not that I don't think we shouldn't discuss the boat thing, but we just had 1 counselor talk about that. Does it automatically go on the agenda then?
No, then I asked Valerie if she was going to talk on that, and she wasn't, and then you raised your hand, and you're not quite talking about it either. But would you like to talk about it? Would you like it to go on the agenda?
Not at this time. I don't think it's ripe for us at this time. I think it's a county responsibility.
Okay. Are there other counselors who are interested in talking about a boat? Rob and Brian are. That makes 3. Okay. Anything further for the agenda? Rick?
When the boat issue comes forward, could we see if there could be an arrangement of acquiring the existing boat for that purpose? Thank you.
Okay. It would be an entirely new job for our fire department, so I think we need to have a conversation about that. Vanessa?
For clarification, they are already responding to swiftwater rescue. They are just woefully unprepared for what they are responding to.
Okay. Anything different? Because we're going to talk about that on a different day. Brian?
Yeah, I have a new topic. One thing that we do at the school district is we have an annual staff survey. It's kind of like a staff climate survey that allows staff to answer questions about, their feelings about their position and just things within their work and their management. And I would like to have a discussion at council about having some sort of anonymous staff survey here as well, just so council's better informed as to how staff's doing, and they can provide us anonymous feedback.
Okay. Are other counselors interested in having that discussion? Vanessa? All right, we got to 2 on that one.
Could you just repeat that, Brian? I'm sorry, I didn't hear everything you said.
Sure. Just having a discussion about potentially doing a staff survey, like a climate survey, just to see, the feelings of staff on their satisfaction with their job. If they, I mean, the survey questions could be developed however we like, but just to kind of get an overall picture of the organization from a more holistic perspective, and to allow staff to have the opportunity to provide comments in an anonymous fashion, so they feel more freely to say what they like.
Yeah, we've discussed something similar, but not the same. I'd like to see that kind of survey tied into a 360 review as part of the manager evaluation process, and that would allow staff anonymous opportunity to comment, I guess, on the performance or their relationship with the city manager, but maybe there would be also a general question about their job satisfaction or their how they feel about things are going. But I think it's the same general idea, so that council has a better idea how staff feels about their working conditions and their support and their their supervisors. So I think to me the two are the kind of the similar discussion. I'd like to see them both together. I think we discussed having a 360 review somewhere on our agenda at some point. I think we already agreed to do that, but I could see those two discussions combining.
So the reason I'm bringing it up in this way is because I have brought up the prospect of the 360 review, and the city manager has informed us that if we want to do that, it has to be a part of the evaluation process for the following year. So given that, we wouldn't be able to have that until at least a year from now, more likely a year and a half from now. So that's why I brought this particular topic up.
So I don't know, I never heard that, but so is that true, Aaron, that somehow a 360 review is off the table for this year? And if so, why is that?
So the contract language is that the evaluation would be mutually agreed upon between the city council and the city manager on a process. And also when it comes to fair and equitable, you provide direction and set the standard at the beginning of the evaluation term, not mid-cycle. So everyone's on the same page with regards to expectations on performance.
Okay, so basically you're saying that you wouldn't agree to it for this year, is what you're saying. It has to be, you said it has to be mutually agreed to.
It's just not part of the existing process.
Right. Well, I brought it up last year, but I guess didn't get enough traction then. Last December, I did bring it up. But you're saying that it has to be mutually agreed to, any change, so you're not ready to agree to it for this year. It would have to be implemented next year if the council decided to do it.
With regard to the climate survey, do you know offhand, is that something that's even in the council's prerogative to request, or is that something we need to investigate further before I think we probably need to talk about that.
Yeah, I think I'd ultimately like to have an opportunity to talk to you, Mayor and Council President, with regards to that at a future time.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to check the charter and see. There's kind of some lines that we can't cross regarding staff, so we'll see where that falls. But I noted it to talk about anyway. Okay, anything further? Joel? Motion to adjourn?
Mayor? Mayor?
I'll make a motion.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering if I could get a head count of who wants to go on the boatneck parade to ride on our fire engine.
Let's just have people talk to you afterwards if they're interested in doing that. Go ahead, Joel.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Second from Brian. All in favor of adjourning today?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. We'll see you next Wednesday.